Well, thanks so much for joining us today. We're joined Mr. Kabilan, who is the Director of National Security and Strategic Foresight for the Conference Board of Canada. And Kabi, you've taken the opportunity to write a lot on the issue of fake news and how people can trust the information they receive. This is obviously brought to great prominence because of what happened in the United States, but our own government has indicated this is a great concern for us as we look forward to the election of 2019. There's nothing more important in democracy than being able to trust the information that we receive as voting citizens. And I've been really intrigued by some of what you have been writing on this topic. I think it's something that's incredibly important for us to be engaged with as parliamentarians. As somebody who was the former parliamentary secretary for democratic institutions, it's something that concerns me a lot. Thank you so much for being with me today. And maybe just turn it over to you at the top here for some of your thoughts on where we're at and what's the size of the problem.
Well, we've certainly seen what happened during the 2016 elections in the U.S., and maybe that's where this whole issue has really come to the fore. For the issue of misinformation and disinformation, one being almost an accidental proliferation, people not meaning to send false information out, and one being directed misinformation or direct disinformation, where people are purposely putting out information that's misleading. You combine those two, and that's kind of what we saw during the U.S. elections in 2016. Now, this creates a number of different problems. Well, first of all, it's what do you trust? What do you believe in? What do you know as being accurate, particularly when you're trying to discuss the merits of someone's candidacy? More insidious to that is the fact that in some cases, and what we're seeing with tools that are now becoming more and more available on the dark web, it's that for a certain sum of money, you can have information being proliferated on social media that is completely false, that could besmirch the character of an individual or even of an organization. How does that affect our debates and our democratic process? And that's certainly a very big concern, not only for myself, but for organizations like the Communication Security Establishment, which recently published a document on this front.
I think, one of the things that we have taken for granted is that the information we obtained through traditional sources would be accurate, even though it might have some form of bias. But the dissemination of information now through social media networks is one concern. The other that I think is particularly coming to the fore is the echo chambers that we're kind of being left in. So the fact that Facebook or Twitter will elevate tweets that seem to correspond to things that we've written before or from people who share opinions. So that the proliferation of this fake news is made possible perhaps through social networks, but that it isn't challenged because people rest inside of these echo chambers, which I think is a real problem. So much so that I oftentimes find that when you're talking to certain people, they have a certain worldview informed by a body of fact. That when they hear something that's outside of that, it's confusing to them because it's something that they haven't encountered. To what extent do you think that is a problem? And then, of course, the bigger question is, from a policy perspective, how do we penetrate that? I mean, if we have people living in these echo chambers where they're not being confronted with different points of view, and where basically fake information could be disseminated so easily, how in a democracy where truth is so vital do we combat that?
The issue of echo chambers was one that was brought up in the analysis post the 2016 elections. Although there are some differing thoughts now as to the impact of echo chambers and whether they're actually having the impact that we think they are. So one of the concerns when echo chambers were originally discussed was the fact that you just raised. All you're surrounded with is information that hardens your worldview or reinforces it, and therefore it's very difficult to have opinion or thought that's different. Some research also suggests that that's just reinforcing what's already there. It's not changing anything fundamentally. So there's an argument over how much of an effect echo chambers actually have. And then one of the suggestions, of course, that if you're trapped in an echo chamber is to try and look outside. But we're also finding research that seems to suggest that when you look outside and it's a worldview that's different, that in some ways creates an emotional reaction. You're even more angry. The other guy or the other girl is wrong because it's in complete disagreement with what you're seeing. So the echo chambers themselves, do they actually change people's opinions? Do they actually shift people? I think the argument is veering towards no, it probably doesn't change viewpoints that they've already got. Do they reinforce some of those? I think that certainly there's plenty of argument to say yes. So maybe the discussion we should be having is what follows from people being influenced by all of this media and all the misinformation that's out there. They may not be changing their opinion, but they might be doing something else. One set of research actually suggests that what's more likely to happen is these types of events can actually, rather than changing your choice in terms of voting, it might change your choice whether to actually go out and vote or not. So it doesn't change your worldview, but it might change some actions which then have a corresponding impact on elections. So I think we also need to move that debate beyond, do these echo chambers and the networks and the fake news, do they actually change people's opinions? Or do they actually change some behaviors which then have a knock-on effect that actually damages democratic processes?
And the trajectory, and I know that you've talked to this a little bit about this as well, of where this is going is perhaps even more concerning than where we are. I know Radiolab did something with Obama where they were able to show how, with use of modern technology, you can fake somebody saying something. So you can have somebody who appears to have said something that they didn't say, and that's disseminated. Within seconds, it can be everywhere, particularly if what they said is controversial, yet pulling it back and getting people to understand that isn't actually what occurred and is extraordinarily difficult. And given that technology is nascent, in other words, it's just at the beginning, that it could be that convincing when it's just at its start. How concerned do you think we should be with that as a possible trend to sort of exacerbate the existing problem?
I think we should be very concerned. And in fact, while those technologies might be a little way out and they might not be accessible to all, the simple technologies that are out there today, taking a photo that's completely out of context, maybe putting a sticker or a logo onto it digitally so it looks like someone's wearing a certain logo, that's easy enough to do. I posted a piece a week or so ago where Snopes.com is one of the sites that tries to debunk fake news. They actually posted a piece where someone had tweeted out that a certain protester or a certain protest group was actually beating police officers. And what this organization, Snopes, showed was that the picture was actually taken from the Greek riots, not from the American context that apparently the person had tweeted out from. Now, this is with nothing more sophisticated than maybe a version of a Photoshop type program just to put that one logo on. We're not even trying to have voices, it's not even video. And yet that gets lots of retweets, lots of likes, other people proliferate it. So on the one hand, even the simple technology is already causing this problem. But I agree with you. If it gets more sophisticated, how are we going to easily be able to tell what's true and what's not? Especially if you could have a computer-generated person, potentially a politician, saying something completely controversial, we couldn't tell if that was the real person or not.
Well, and I think what was striking to me as I heard interviews with some of the people that were developing the technology is that there maybe isn't a full understanding of just how profound an impact this could have on discourse. When we think of the civil rights movement as an example, how powerful it was to have images of what was really happening on the ground in places like Selma, and how those images or videos came to inform policy decisions and the reaction of the public, and led to really was the genesis of the civil rights movement moving forward. And you ask yourself if people can be denied information, and we're already seeing that to happen to a certain extent today. that how is that going to inform our discourse on a future-looking basis? Something that certainly I'm very concerned about as a parliamentarian. I know our government is overall. But what do you think the answer is? I mean, how do we then, and I mean, it's a big question, but how do we ensure that the population writ large has access to verifiable information? Obviously, part of it probably is going to be media literacy, getting young people and the population generally to think critically about what they're watching and not to just to assume. But are there other thoughts that you have from a policy perspective on how the government can address this threat?
So I think you hit the nail on the head with the first suggestion around literacy. So it's literally that broad swathe of education. The one thing I would add to that is it's not just young people. I always use, and my father hates it when I do this, but I use my 80-year-old father as the example of the nightmare on the internet. He's very well educated, he's a double chartered engineer, but he doesn't understand the internet. And being able to verify, for example, a piece of news that comes into him, where he's been used to opening a newspaper, taking that as truth, because it's a well-written paper, it's a journalist he trusts, versus getting an email, maybe from a friend, with a piece of news. And his ability to distinguish between the two and how to verify that it is actually true starts breaking down when it comes to the internet and it comes on email. So it's not just a younger generation that needs this. In fact, I would say all of us need a little bit of this. So that's only one piece that can help. Getting people to think critically, getting people to ask questions and ask, where did that news come from? Who is it from? What motive might they have in sending it to me? So I think that's part of it. Another part of it, which is actually, interestingly, something we're seeing during Hurricane Harvey, we're actually seeing fake news, a variety of things, from scams, from fake hashtags about looting, spreading on the back of what's happening in Harvey, which is terrible. But at the same time, one of the things that's helped is actually a lot of the local media on the ground, plus some trusted accounts, people build representatives who have built their social media standing for a long period, so they have a trusted following. They've been, of course, sending out a lot of news during that event. And because they've basically been swapping out fake news, a lot of that fake news has actually had a very minimal impact. So the other thing we could think about in terms of policies, particularly for those who represent this publicly, what sort of presence do you have in the channels that people are currently listening to? How do you cultivate that? How do you provide information? How do you build that trust? And I think that also applies to public institutions. If a disaster happens, let's say it is in Ottawa, I want to know that I can trust the city of Ottawa speed. The city of Calgary managed to do that really well during the 2013 flood. And therefore, when I get a tweet that says, you know what, there's an outage 2 streets down from you, I'll go, well, did the city of Calgary say that, or did someone else say that? Because I know the city of Calgary is pretty good at getting the right information to me in a timely manner. So the other thing we can do is making sure that our institutions and our leaders actually have that trusted voice within the public sphere, in social media and within other platforms that people are using to proliferate.
And would you say, because one of the things, Cabby, that we see is, there was an expectation during elections, a very heated rhetoric when, politicians will present their case in a very black and white way when often there's a lot more gray there. And in the past, that would be through a traditional media filter examined critically, and you would see an exposition of what the real facts were and whether or not those hyperbolic statements were true or not. I'm wondering, is there a risk in now, given the fact that there is this propensity to have fake news and these ways to propagate fake information, is there a greater risk in that hyperbole politically, and perhaps a greater responsibility as well that has to be paid politically to what is said because of the fact that there's, frankly, a risk that doesn't move through a critical lens? And if there is a greater responsibility, how do we, I guess one of the questions we're going to have to work out is for people who are responsible, who don't engage in hyperbole. They're facing opponents who perhaps are heavily rewarded for being hyperbolic, maybe as kind, being outright dishonest and propagating falsehood. And I mean, that's one of the things that concerns me is that on the one hand, I see that there is a need to have more clarity and more honesty in political discourse. But on the other hand, that honesty is going to be up against some incredibly powerful forces.
So there's a couple of things in there. So first and foremost, I would say that this issue not only applies to politicians, it applies to anyone who has a major public voice. If you were Taylor Swift and you said something to your entire Twitter following, which is one of the largest globally, you actually get a message that goes out there to a lot of people who trust what you say. So it does apply far beyond just our political discourse. There are lots of other leaders out there, thought leaders out there, celebrities, all of whom have these followings, and all of whom, if they were to proliferate a message that's false, skewed, could affect the public's perception. The challenge, though, and I think you put it quite well, is there is a lot of gray when it comes to some of these discussions. Even when we look at science, science isn't always definite in all of its conclusions. There's some gray areas, possibility of change. It might be small, but it's still there. And so it makes the argument difficult. Sometimes there isn't a black and white. We have to have people who are able to go and look at the problem, make a decision for themselves. What evidence is there for the argument? What evidence is there against it? And how does that help them make a decision? I'll go back to the original point made about how we deal with this. And I think it's not so much trying to put any form of control over the discussions. I think it goes back to those who are receiving the discussions in many ways. It's giving them the tools and enabling them to quickly check out, is that fact true? What should I think about this? Where else can I find information about this issue? I think it will be more about equipping people to make those decisions rather than trying to change and form how that discourse gets out.
And Cabby, as a last point, when you think, when you go to bed at night and you're thinking about the future of our democracy and where things are going, where's your head on this? How worried are you, and how able do you think we're going to be to rise to the challenge that's in front of us?
For our democracy, I certainly, like the communication security establishment, I certainly have my concerns over how these types of activities, the whole fake news phenomenon, is going to affect the discourse and potentially what might happen on the back of that. Whilst the evidence currently suggests that this type of discourse does not affect the actual outcome of elections, there's enough to suggest that it can create other side effects, whether it's protests, whether in some cases it might allow fringe groups to come to the fore, now feel that they're part of that discussion. There are other side effects that go beyond that. The piece that does worry me about the whole fake news phenomenon is not so much a change in people's minds in terms of their political views. That doesn't seem really possible on current evidence. But it's that other phenomenon where you might influence someone to actually go out and vote or not to vote. And certainly there's some evidence out there that suggests that this is possible. So that's one concern. The second big concern I have is actually the tools that are being used to proliferate fake news. Now, certainly there's been a lot of accusations over a state actor being involved in the US elections and tools they may or may not have used in that respect. What if those tools become more widely available to just about anyone, including any ordinary person? And that's starting to happen with some of the tools that we're seeing on the dark web. Anyone can access them, and for the right amount of money, you could proliferate the story of your choice. When that happens, that becomes more concerning because now anyone can literally spring up and push out a huge fake message if they wanted to. I dealt with the reviews of the 2011 riots that happened in London, and one of the things that I'm sure you know from the news coverage is how messaging systems and in some cases social media systems played a role in implementing disturbances in different areas, sometimes where there was none. So my concern is if you've got these tools now, you have an even more powerful, if you like, cannon to get that information out. So if you wanted to proliferate trouble in multiple areas, it becomes far easier for far more people to do it. So my concern is now the almost democratization of some of these tools. That anyone can access it, anyone can use it. That certainly does keep me up at night.
And it's a double-edged sword because, of course, it has in tremendous danger in that it can be used poorly. But there are other examples where we see it's used as a tool to propagate truth and to uncover things that are false and to uncover corruption. And I mean, I guess it makes the point overall that in this battle for truth, that there's a really an increased responsibility that all of us have beyond politicians or opinion leaders to
Sorry, can I just one
please.
point of clarification? When I talk about the democratization of these tools, it's not social media that I'm talking about. It is actually the weaponized tools that you use to leverage social media fake news. So I totally agree with you. In terms of social media itself, I'm 100% on board that it's a double-edged sword. My concern's more about the tools that lie underneath them that allow you to proliferate messages on social media, and those dark tools becoming democratized.
Well, it's a great point. I guess maybe just one corollary to that is perhaps if people are directly confronted with information that they see is fake and looks real, and that becomes part of their day-to-day life, perhaps that will cause people to become more critical and more introspective and to think deeper on these issues and to search for information in a way that is more vigorous. I guess we can hope on that point. It's a hypothetical, but Kabi, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's an incredibly important issue, one that I know that I and in the government are seized with, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much, and we'll continue a series on issues that are pertinent to Parliament, things that are topical, and be continuing this series in the days ahead. So look for that, and thanks for joining us today.